There was a moment before the fire was stolen, before the chains and the eagle and the eternal torment on the mountain, when Prometheus stood before the assembled gods and spoke words that should have changed everything. Not a plea or a threat, but a warning so precise and devastating that it mapped out exactly how divine power would crumble if they continued on their current path. He told them what would happen to mortals, what would happen to the Olympians themselves, what forces they were setting in motion that would eventually consume the very order they believed was eternal. The gods listened in absolute silence as Prometheus laid out a future that was still preventable, a catastrophe that could be avoided if they made different choices in that crucial moment. Then when he finished speaking, Zeus laughed, not nervously or dismissively, but with genuine amusement, as if Prometheus had told an entertaining joke rather than revealing a prophecy that threatened everything they had built. Within hours, the council had voted to ignore the warning entirely, proceeding with decisions that would prove Prometheus right in ways that none of them, not even the Titan himself, could have fully anticipated. Before we reveal what Prometheus saw coming and why the gods chose blindness over wisdom, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The truth they buried begins now. Prometheus occupied a unique position in the divine hierarchy, simultaneously inside the power structure of Olympus and fundamentally separate from it. He was a Titan, member of the generation that had ruled before Zeus and his siblings overthrew their father Cronus and established the new order. Most Titans had been cast into Tartarus after losing that war, imprisoned in the deepest pit of the underworld, where they could never threaten Olympian supremacy again. But Prometheus and his brother Prometheus had sided with Zeus during the conflict, providing strategic advice and intelligence about Titan movements that had been crucial to the younger god's victory. As reward for this betrayal of his own generation, Prometheus had been allowed to remain free and had been given a role in the new administration, serving as an advisor whose insights into long-term patterns and consequences were considered valuable even by gods who generally preferred not to think too far ahead. The quality that made Prometheus useful was also what made him dangerous. He possessed foresight that went beyond simple prediction into genuine understanding of how systems developed and collapsed over time. Where other immortals saw only the immediate situation, Prometheus perceived the cascading consequences that would unfold across centuries and millennia. He understood that actions which seemed beneficial in the short term could plant seeds of destruction that would only germinate after enough time had passed for everyone to forget the original cause. This ability to see patterns that others missed had made him invaluable during the war against the Titans, allowing Zeus to anticipate and counter strategies before they could be fully implemented. But in peacetime, this same foresight became inconvenient because it kept raising concerns about policies and decisions that the Olympian leadership preferred to consider settled and beyond questioning. The specific issue that prompted Prometheus to request a formal council meeting involved the treatment of humans, those strange creatures that the gods had created as a combination of entertainment and worship-generating resources. Humanity had been designed deliberately weak, deliberately limited, given just enough intelligence to build civilizations and offer sacrifices, but not enough to pose any threat to divine supremacy. The gods had withheld fire, advanced tool-making knowledge, medicine, philosophy, all the things that might allow humans to become truly independent, rather than remaining in a state of perpetual childhood requiring divine supervision. This arrangement was considered ideal by most Olympians, who enjoyed being worshipped and who found human struggles amusing to observe, but who had no interest in dealing with mortals as anything approaching equals. Prometheus had watched this system operating for several generations of human existence, and what he observed troubled him profoundly. The limitations imposed on humanity were not keeping them safely contained, but rather were creating pressures that would eventually explode in ways the gods had not anticipated. Humans were learning despite the restrictions, developing capabilities that were crude and inefficient, but which showed unmistakable trajectory toward independence. More concerning, the very weaknesses that were supposed to keep them manageable were also making them desperate, driving them toward innovations and social structures that would ultimately pose far greater challenges to divine authority than if they had simply been given knowledge and tools from the beginning. Prometheus saw a future where humanity either destroyed itself through the desperation of ignorance or learned enough to become genuinely dangerous to the gods. And either outcome seemed worse than the alternative of providing measured guidance that would allow human development along safer paths. But there was another element to Prometheus's concern, one that went beyond simple risk management about mortal capabilities. He had spent time among humans, walking through their villages and cities in disguise, observing them in ways that his fellow immortals rarely bothered to do. What he discovered was that these supposedly simple creatures were capable of remarkable things when given even minimal opportunities. He saw kindness and creativity, courage and love, qualities that existed despite rather than because of divine influence. Prometheus found himself genuinely liking humans, appreciating them as something more than just amusing playthings or worship generators. This emotional connection complicated his strategic concerns because it meant he was not simply calculating risk, but actually caring about the outcome for these mortal beings, whose lives were measured in decades rather than eternities. The request for a full council meeting was unusual enough that Zeus initially refused it, suggesting that whatever concerns Prometheus had could be addressed through normal channels rather than requiring the assembly of all major Olympians. But Prometheus insisted that the matter was urgent and significant enough to warrant everyone's attention, and he invoked old promises that Zeus had made during the Titan War about always listening to the advice of those who had helped establish Olympian rule. Faced with this formal invocation, Zeus grudgingly agreed to convene the council, though his attitude made clear that he considered this an unnecessary inconvenience and that Prometheus had better have something genuinely important to discuss rather than wasting everyone's time with minor administrative concerns. The council chamber on Olympus was a vast circular hall with a domed ceiling that showed the constellations wheeling overhead, a reminder of the cosmic scope of divine power. 12 thrones arranged in a perfect circle, each reflecting the personality and domain of its occupant, with Zeus's throne elevated slightly above the others in a compromise between his insistence on supremacy and the other gods' resistance to too much visible hierarchy. When Prometheus entered and stood in the center of this circle, he felt the weight of divine attention focusing on him in ways that would have destroyed a mortal instantly. These were beings of enormous power and even greater pride, accustomed to being obeyed and worshipped, not challenged or warned about dangers they had supposedly already considered and dismissed. Speaking truth to this particular form of power required either enormous courage or fundamental misunderstanding of how much danger he was placing himself in. Prometheus began not with the warning itself, but with a detailed analysis of current conditions, laying factual groundwork that would make his eventual conclusions unavoidable if anyone was actually listening with open minds rather than defensive resistance. He described the trajectory of human development, the patterns of innovation despite restrictions, the social structures emerging in response to shared hardship. He talked about the quality of human consciousness, the ways these supposedly simple creatures were already starting to ask questions that would eventually lead them to dangerous territories. He explained how the very limitations that were meant to keep humanity controllable were instead creating evolutionary pressures that selected for cunning, rebellion, and the kind of desperate creativity that would eventually break any cage no matter how carefully constructed. Every statement was supported with specific observations, presented without emotional appeal or dramatic emphasis, simply laying out reality and inviting the council to acknowledge what was clearly happening right in front of them if they chose to look honestly. The assembled gods listened to Prometheus's initial presentation with varying degrees of attention and skepticism. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic thinking, followed his argument carefully and seemed troubled by some of the patterns he identified. Hephaestus, who worked with tools and understood craft, nodded occasionally at observations about human technical development that matched his own experiences. But others were clearly impatient, waiting for Prometheus to finish his preamble and get to whatever point he was trying to make. Ares looked bored and kept fidgeting with his weapons. Aphrodite was conducting a whispered conversation with Hermes that had nothing to do with Prometheus's speech. Hera's face showed the particular expression of someone who has already decided to disagree, regardless of what arguments might be presented. Zeus sat forward on his throne when Prometheus finally shifted from analysis to prediction, sensing that this was the crucial section where the Titan's real concerns would be revealed. The room fell into complete silence as Prometheus began describing not what was currently happening, but what would inevitably follow if current policies continued unchanged. He spoke of a future where humans would discover fire and all that fire enabled, not because it was given to them, but because they would steal it or discover it independently through the kind of chance accident that became increasingly likely the larger human populations grew. Once they had fire, everything else would follow in a cascade that the gods could not control or stop. Tool-making would advance from stone to bronze to iron. Agriculture would intensify beyond simple subsistence. Cities would grow large enough that human organization could challenge divine authority through collective action, if not through individual power. But this technological development was only the first part of the future Prometheus saw unfolding. More dangerous than tools or weapons was the change that would occur in human consciousness itself. As mortals gained capabilities and confidence, they would start questioning the divine order that had always seemed natural and inevitable. They would wonder why they should worship gods who demanded sacrifice, but offered little in return except not destroying them. They would develop philosophies that explain the world through natural principles rather than divine whim. They would create art and literature that celebrated human achievement rather than simply praising immortal power. Within several centuries at most, Prometheus predicted, humanity would reach a threshold where divine authority became optional rather than absolute, where worship became a cultural habit rather than a desperate necessity, where the Olympians would find themselves ruling over an increasingly indifferent population that neither feared them sufficiently nor needed them urgently enough to maintain the current power dynamic. Zeus interrupted at this point, his voice carrying both amusement and warning, asking Prometheus if he was seriously suggesting that mortal humans could ever pose a genuine threat to immortal gods whose power made them essentially untouchable. The Titan's response was careful but firm. He was not suggesting humans would overpower the Olympians through direct force, but rather that they would make divine rule irrelevant through cultural and philosophical evolution. The real danger was not that mortals would storm Olympus with weapons, but that they would simply stop caring whether the gods existed, stop making sacrifices, stop teaching their children to worship, stop organizing their societies around divine preferences. When that happened, when humans achieved functional independence from divine influence, the gods would face a choice between escalating violence to force compliance or accepting a diminished role that would eventually reduce them to folklore rather than living powers. Prometheus expanded on this vision of divine decline, painting a picture that was simultaneously subtle and devastating. He described temples falling into disrepair, not because they were destroyed, but because no one bothered to maintain them. Sacrifices becoming smaller and less frequent because humans found better uses for their resources. The great festivals and games that honored the Olympians, turning into cultural traditions, maintained from habit rather than genuine belief. This slow fade from relevance would be worse than any dramatic defeat because it would be essentially irreversible. Once humans discovered they could live without divine intervention, once they built systems of knowledge and social organization that did not require gods to explain or justify them, there would be no going back to the old relationship where mortals looked to Olympus for guidance and meaning. The prophecy grew darker as Prometheus continued, describing not just the decline of divine authority, but the specific ways individual Olympians would suffer from these changes. Zeus, who drew power from being king of gods and men alike, would find his sovereignty increasingly hollow as human kingdoms stopped legitimizing themselves through claims of divine favor. Hera's role as guardian of marriage would become ceremonial when humans developed their own social rules about relationships that did not require divine sanctioning. Ares would discover that human warfare grew more terrible and more independent of divine influence as technology advanced, turning him from a patron of battle into an increasingly obsolete symbol. Each god would face their own particular form of irrelevance as humanity developed capabilities and institutions that served the same functions the Olympians had once monopolized. But Prometheus saved his most shocking prediction for last, and this was the one that would ultimately cost him everything. He stated clearly and without qualification that Zeus himself would eventually be overthrown, not by other gods in the kind of succession that had already occurred twice in divine history, but by forces that Zeus's own policies were setting in motion. The specific mechanism Prometheus described was complex, involving the intersection of divine paranoia with human development, creating conditions that would make Zeus vulnerable to challenges he currently considered impossible. The Titan would not provide details about timing or exact circumstances, claiming that knowing too much about the future could paradoxically prevent people from making the changes necessary to avoid it. But he insisted that the pattern was clear and inevitable, unless the fundamental approach to ruling both gods and mortals changed dramatically from what Zeus currently practiced. The reaction to this final prediction was immediate and explosive. Zeus rose from his throne with thunder literally rumbling around him, demanding that Prometheus either explain exactly what he meant by prophesying divine overthrow or admit that he was inventing dramatic claims to make his concerns seem more urgent than they actually were. The other gods reacted with similar outrage mixed with varying degrees of concern, some because they were genuinely troubled by the implications, and others because they understood that questioning Zeus's eternal rule was the one thing that was absolutely forbidden in Olympian politics. Prometheus found himself suddenly isolated in the center of the council chamber, surrounded by divine fury that could destroy him instantly if Zeus decided his words constituted treason rather than warning. The Titan stood his ground despite the danger, explaining with the same measured tone he had used throughout that he was not inventing threats, but rather describing patterns that were already visible to anyone willing to look honestly at the trajectory of current events. He reminded them that he had foreseen the outcome of the Titan War correctly, had predicted Cronus's defeat when others thought the older generation was invincible, had earned the right to be taken seriously when he spoke about long-term developments. His warning about Zeus's eventual fall was not a curse or a threat, but simply an extension of the same analytical capability that had served them all so well during the conflict that established their current power. Ignoring this warning would not make it less accurate, but would simply ensure that when the future arrived, it would catch them completely unprepared and unable to respond effectively. The council chamber erupted into argument as different gods took different positions on how to respond to Prometheus's prophecy. Athena urged her father to consider carefully whether the Titan's warnings might contain legitimate concerns, even if his conclusions seemed exaggerated. She pointed out that dismissing strategic advice based on wounded pride rather than careful analysis was exactly the kind of mistake that had destroyed previous divine regimes. Hephaestus supported this position more quietly, noting that Prometheus had accurately described technical developments he had observed among humans, and suggesting that perhaps the social predictions deserved similar consideration rather than automatic rejection. Apollo, whose domain included prophecy and who therefore had his own complicated relationship with knowing unwelcome futures, argued that genuine foresight should be honored even when it revealed uncomfortable truths. But these voices of caution were overwhelmed by gods whose primary response to the prophecy was defensive anger. Ares declared that any suggestion humans could threaten divine power was absurd, and that the proper response to Prometheus was immediate punishment for spreading panic rather than engaging with his arguments. Aphrodite, who generally avoided politics but sensed an opportunity to curry favor with Zeus, suggested sweetly that perhaps Prometheus had spent too much time among mortals and had forgotten the vast gulf that separated divine power from human weakness. Hera, still resentful that Zeus had elevated Prometheus despite his Titan heritage, seized on the prophecy about her husband's overthrow as proof that the Titan had never truly been loyal and was probably plotting rebellion disguised as helpful advice. Poseidon's intervention was particularly significant because he was Zeus's brother, and therefore one of the few gods who could speak with genuine authority about matters involving the king's rule. The sea god acknowledged that Prometheus had been useful in the past, but argued that the current warning crossed a line from helpful advice into destructive speculation. Prophesying divine overthrow, regardless of intentions, planted seeds of doubt and discord that could become self-fulfilling even if the original prediction was baseless. Better to silence such talk immediately and decisively, rather than allowing it to circulate and undermine confidence in Zeus's eternal kingship. Poseidon's words carried weight precisely because they came from someone with his own claim to power, suggesting that even gods who might potentially benefit from Zeus's weakening believed maintaining the current stability was more important than entertaining Prometheus's concerns. Zeus listened to all these arguments with a face that revealed nothing, though those who knew him well could see rage building beneath the controlled exterior. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that was far more dangerous than shouting would have been. He thanked Prometheus for his service during the Titan War and acknowledged that the council had been valuable in the past. But Zeus continued with that terrifying calm. There was a difference between useful advice and destructive prophecy, between helping secure Olympian power and undermining it through dire predictions that served no purpose except to spread fear and doubt. The king of the gods then did something that demonstrated both his political skill and his fundamental inability to handle criticism, even when it came from genuinely loyal sources. Rather than directly punishing Prometheus, which would have made the Titan into a martyr and given weight to his warnings by suggesting Zeus feared them, he proposed a compromise that was actually a trap. Prometheus would be assigned responsibility for continuing human development, working directly with mortals to ensure they advanced in ways that served Olympian interests rather than threatening them. If the Titan truly understood human nature and development as well as he claimed, then he could use that knowledge to guide them along safe paths. But Zeus added with a smile that made clear this was a test rather than genuine delegation. Prometheus would be held personally accountable for any problems that arose from human advancement. If mortals became dangerous or rebellious or independent in the ways he had predicted, that would prove his prophecy had been designed to create the very outcome he claimed to be warning against. This assignment was brilliant in its cruelty because it forced Prometheus into an impossible position. If he refused, he would appear to be withdrawing from the responsibility of helping manage the problems he had identified, suggesting his concerns had been exaggerated or insincere. If he accepted, he would be personally accountable for preventing the very developments he had predicted were inevitable without fundamental policy changes that Zeus clearly had no intention of making. Prometheus understood the trap, but also understood he had no choice except to walk into it. Refusing would accomplish nothing except removing him from any position where he might influence outcomes, while accepting at least gave him the opportunity to try mitigating the damage, even if ultimate failure was probably inevitable. He agreed to take responsibility for human development, with one condition that Zeus could not refuse without appearing petty: that he be given actual authority to make decisions about what knowledge and capabilities humans were allowed to access, rather than simply being expected to prevent their advancement while maintaining current restrictions that made such prevention impossible. Zeus agreed with exaggerated graciousness, making a show of trusting Prometheus with significant responsibility, while everyone in the council chamber understood this was theater rather than genuine delegation. The king announced that Prometheus would serve as an intermediary between Olympus and humanity, determining what knowledge could be safely shared and ensuring that mortal development proceeded along lines that reinforced rather than threatened divine authority. Other gods clearly saw this as a punishment disguised as promotion, a way of making Prometheus responsible for an unsolvable problem while maintaining the appearance of addressing his concerns. But they also recognized the political brilliance of the maneuver. The way Zeus had neutralized a critic without creating the kind of dramatic confrontation that might make other gods wonder whether the prophecy had been closer to truth than anyone wanted to admit. As the council dissolved and gods departed to their various domains, Prometheus remained in the circular chamber, thinking about what had just occurred. He had presented clear analysis and specific predictions about futures that could still be avoided with policy changes, and the response had been to make him personally responsible for preventing those futures while denying him the authority to implement the changes necessary for prevention to succeed. It was a masterclass in political deflection, protecting power by acknowledging concerns just enough to appear responsive, while ensuring that the person raising concerns would be blamed when they inevitably materialized. Prometheus recognized that he was now trapped in a game where the rules were designed to guarantee his eventual punishment, regardless of what he actually did or did not accomplish. Prometheus began his assigned role as intermediary to humanity, with genuine effort to work within the impossible constraints Zeus had established. He spent months observing human communities across different regions, assessing their development and identifying the minimum knowledge that might allow them to survive and advance without triggering the complete societal collapse he feared was approaching. His recommendations to Olympus were careful and modest, proposing incremental expansions of permitted knowledge that would relieve the most dangerous pressures without fundamentally challenging divine authority. He suggested teaching humans about crop rotation to reduce famine-driven desperation. He proposed sharing basic medical knowledge that would lower infant mortality and create more stable populations. He recommended allowing limited metallurgy that would improve tools without advancing weapons to genuinely threatening levels. Every single recommendation was rejected by the Olympian Council, usually without serious consideration. Zeus had made clear that the current restrictions on human knowledge would remain in place, that Prometheus's job was to manage human development within existing limitations, rather than to expand what mortals were permitted to know. The other gods generally supported this position, some because they agreed with Zeus's assessment, and others because they recognized that questioning divine policy on human limitations was politically dangerous after Prometheus's prophecy had been so publicly dismissed. The few gods who might have been sympathetic to gradual expansion of human capabilities like Athena or Hephaestus, remained silent rather than associating themselves with positions that Zeus had already demonstrated he would interpret as disloyalty. Watching human suffering that could be alleviated through knowledge that was being deliberately withheld was harder than Prometheus had anticipated. He had always known intellectually that divine restrictions on mortality caused unnecessary hardship, but seeing it up close day after day transformed abstract understanding into visceral rage. Children died from diseases that could be prevented with basic hygiene knowledge. Entire communities starved because they lacked agricultural techniques that could be taught in an afternoon. Violence escalated in societies that had no legal frameworks or conflict resolution systems more sophisticated than whoever was strongest getting to decide outcomes. All of this suffering existed by divine decree, maintained not because it served any legitimate purpose, but simply because gods preferred mortals to remain dependent and weak. The specific decision to steal fire emerged gradually, rather than appearing as a sudden plan. Prometheus had initially hoped to work within Olympian restrictions, finding creative ways to help humans without technically violating the limitations Zeus had imposed. But as months passed and every proposal was rejected, and human suffering continued unchanged, he began to accept that meaningful change would require breaking rules rather than working within them. Fire was the obvious choice because it was simultaneously the most immediately useful gift he could provide and the most clearly forbidden, representing exactly the kind of transformative knowledge that divine authority most feared humans possessing. Giving mortals fire would unquestionably violate his mandate and would certainly trigger severe punishment, but it would also genuinely help humanity in ways that justified the personal cost. The mechanics of stealing fire were less complicated than the decision to do so. Prometheus had access to Olympus and moved through divine spaces without attracting unusual attention. Hephaestus's forges burned constantly, producing the weapons and tools that gods required for their various purposes. Taking a torch from those sacred flames required only waiting for a moment when the smith god was distracted, then carrying the fire down from Olympus to the mortal world before it could be noticed missing. The real challenge was not the theft itself, but rather accepting what would follow once Zeus discovered what had happened and who was responsible. Prometheus knew with absolute certainty that punishment would be severe, that his usefulness during the Titan War would no longer protect him once he had deliberately violated the most important restriction Zeus had placed on human development. The night Prometheus brought fire to humanity was unremarkable, except for the single action that would change everything. He descended from Olympus carrying a fennel stalk concealing the stolen flame, traveled to a human settlement that he had been monitoring, and taught them not just how to maintain fire but how to use it. He showed them cooking and heating and tool working and all the practical applications that would make fire genuinely transformative rather than just a curiosity. The humans received this gift with reverence mixed with the kind of wild joy that comes from suddenly gaining capabilities you had not known were possible. They understood instinctively that something fundamental had changed, that they had been given not just a tool but a doorway to futures that had previously been closed to them. Prometheus stayed with that initial community for 3 days, ensuring they understood how to manage fire safely and how to spread this knowledge to others. He explained that the gift came with responsibility, that fire could destroy as easily as it could create, that they would need to be thoughtful about how they use this new capability. But he also made clear that this was their knowledge now, that no god could take it back once humans possessed it, that they were entering a new relationship with the world and with the divine powers that had previously controlled their development so completely. The humans listened with expressions that mixed hope and terror, understanding that their benefactor had just changed everything, and that change carried dangers along with possibilities. News of the theft reached Olympus before Prometheus returned, carried by minor deities and nature spirits who had witnessed fire spreading across human settlements with a speed that suggested divine intervention rather than natural discovery. Zeus's rage when he understood what had happened was spectacular, even by the standards of a god known for dramatic fury. Thunder shook Olympus and lightning struck the earth in patterns that killed randomly and terrifyingly. Divine anger made manifest in ways that harmed no one responsible for the actual offense, but demonstrated power in its rawest form. The king of the gods summoned his council immediately, demanding to know how Prometheus had been allowed to commit such a blatant violation of divine decree and what punishment would be severe enough to serve as warning to any others who might consider similar disobedience. The council that assembled this time was very different from the earlier meeting where Prometheus had delivered his warning. Then there had been debate and discussion about how to respond to uncomfortable predictions. Now, there was only unanimous agreement that the Titan had betrayed their trust and needed to be punished in ways that would demonstrate what happened to those who defied Zeus's authority. Even gods who had been sympathetic to Prometheus's earlier concerns joined the consensus supporting harsh punishment, recognizing that whatever the merits of his arguments about human development, he had crossed a line by taking unilateral action that directly contradicted explicit divine policy. Athena spoke about the importance of respecting established authority even when disagreeing with specific decisions. Hephaestus suggested that perhaps Prometheus had gone mad from spending too much time among mortals and should be imprisoned for his own protection as much as for punishment. Only Apollo remained conspicuously silent, neither defending nor condemning, his expression suggesting he understood dimensions of the situation that others were missing. Zeus announced the punishment personally, describing in detail what would happen to Prometheus as consequence of his theft and betrayal. The Titan would be chained to a mountain in the Caucasus, bound with restraints forged by Hephaestus that even divine strength could not break. An eagle would visit him daily, tearing out his liver, which would regenerate overnight, creating an eternal cycle of agony that would continue for as long as Zeus decreed. This punishment served multiple purposes simultaneously. It removed Prometheus from any position where he could influence events. It provided a visible demonstration of what defying divine authority cost. And it satisfied Zeus's personal rage at having his prophecy about divine overthrow associated with someone who had now proven themselves untrustworthy through deliberate disobedience. The sentence was final and absolute, with no possibility of appeal or eventual release unless Zeus himself chose to show mercy. The chaining of Prometheus became one of the defining moments of Olympian rule, a demonstration of divine power that was simultaneously impressive and unsettling to those who witnessed it. Hephaestus was ordered to forge the chains and personally bind the Titan to his mountain, a task the smith god approached with visible reluctance, but completed with his characteristic skill. The restraints were works of art as much as instruments of torture, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, designed to last for eternity while ensuring maximum suffering for the prisoner they held. Prometheus submitted to his binding without resistance or complaint, his face showing neither fear nor regret, simply acceptance that this was the price he had known would come due when he made his choice to steal fire for humanity. The eagle that would serve as instrument of daily torture was no ordinary bird, but rather a creature created specifically for this purpose, large enough to tear through divine flesh and vicious enough to find joy in its assigned task. Zeus personally instructed the eagle in its duties, making clear that the torment needed to be severe enough to serve as eternal reminder of the cost of defying Olympian authority. The first day that the eagle arrived and began its work, Prometheus screamed in agony that echoed across the mountain and carried down to human settlements far below. People heard the sound and understood instinctively that their benefactor was suffering for the gift he had given them, and some wept while others felt the first stirrings of rage against the divine powers that would inflict such punishment for the crime of helping mortals survive and advance. As years passed and then centuries, the bound Titan became a fixture of the landscape, so constant that it was easy to forget he had once walked freely among gods and men. Travelers occasionally climbed the mountain to see him, some out of morbid curiosity and others seeking wisdom from someone who had defied the gods and paid such a terrible price. Prometheus received these visitors with varying degrees of patience, sometimes sharing insights about human development or divine politics, and sometimes simply asking to be left alone with his suffering. He never expressed regret for stealing fire, but also never encouraged others to follow his example, understanding that martyrdom was a personal choice that should not be imposed on anyone through inspirational rhetoric about necessary sacrifice. What Prometheus observed from his mountain was exactly the future he had predicted unfolding across the world below. Human civilization advanced rapidly once fire enabled tool-making and cooking and all the cascading capabilities that followed. Agriculture intensified, cities grew larger and more complex. Trade networks expanded across regions and eventually across seas. Humans developed writing systems to record knowledge, legal codes to organize societies, philosophical frameworks to understand existence without requiring divine explanation for everything. The advancement was not smooth or uniformly positive, as human capacity for violence and destruction also grew along with their constructive capabilities. But the overall trajectory was clear. Mortals were becoming increasingly independent, building civilizations that functioned according to their own logic, rather than simply reflecting divine preferences. The gods watched this development with growing alarm mixed with denial about its implications. Zeus insisted that human advancement was manageable, that mortals remained fundamentally dependent on divine favor, regardless of their technical capabilities, that the old order was as secure as ever, even as evidence accumulated that something fundamental was changing in the relationship between Olympus and the world below. Other gods recognized the shift more clearly, but felt powerless to reverse it without actions that would have required admitting Prometheus had been right about trajectories they had dismissed. Better to maintain the fiction that everything was proceeding according to plan than to acknowledge they had ignored a crucial warning and were now dealing with consequences they could have prevented. The prophecy about Zeus's eventual overthrow had not been forgotten, despite efforts to suppress discussion of it. The prediction lingered in the background of Olympian politics, coloring interactions and breeding paranoia that made the king of the gods increasingly suspicious of potential rivals. Zeus began making decisions designed to prevent any possible challenge to his authority, actions that ironically created exactly the kind of conditions Prometheus had warned would make divine rule vulnerable. The growing paranoia drove wedges between Zeus and other Olympians, eroded the alliances that had sustained his kingship, and created resentments that built toward eventual confrontation. The mechanism of Zeus's downfall, when it eventually occurred, was different from what anyone expected, but followed the pattern Prometheus had identified. Divine power undermined by its own defensiveness, collapsing under contradictions it refused to acknowledge or address. Humanity's relationship with the gods evolved exactly as Prometheus had predicted it would, once mortals gained sufficient knowledge and capability. Worship continued, but transformed from desperate necessity into cultural tradition, maintained more from habit than from genuine belief in divine authority. Sacrifices became smaller and less frequent as humans found better uses for their resources. The great temples remained as architectural achievements, but their religious significance faded as philosophy and science provided alternative frameworks for understanding the world. The Olympians found themselves ruling over populations that neither feared them sufficiently nor needed them urgently enough to maintain the old power dynamic. Divine authority became increasingly hollow, maintained through occasional dramatic demonstrations, but lacking the universal acceptance that had once made it seem natural and inevitable. The irony was not lost on those few gods perceptive enough to recognize it. Prometheus's punishment was supposed to serve as warning about the cost of defying divine authority, but it actually demonstrated that such authority was already weak enough to require brutal enforcement rather than commanding natural obedience. A truly secure power structure would not need to torture someone eternally for giving knowledge to mortals. The very extremity of the punishment revealed the gods' fear that their control was more fragile than they wanted to admit, that the restrictions they imposed on humanity required constant violent maintenance because they were not accepted as legitimate by those they governed. Prometheus had offered them a path to adapt and maintain relevance, and by rejecting that path, they had guaranteed their own gradual obsolescence. Centuries after the theft of fire, when heroes walked the earth and the age of myth was beginning its slow transition toward the age of philosophy and reason, someone eventually freed Prometheus from his chains. The stories about who performed this liberation vary depending on which account you trust, but the most common version credits Heracles, the strongest of heroes who was completing his own set of impossible labors and who killed the eagle and broke the chains as an incidental part of his journey. Prometheus was carried down from his mountain weak and exhausted from centuries of daily torment, but alive and still capable of speech and thought despite everything he had endured. His first question, according to witnesses, was not about his own condition, but about how far humanity had advanced during his imprisonment. When told that mortals were now building democracies and philosophies, writing epic poetry and mathematical proofs, he smiled despite his pain and said simply that the suffering had been worth it. The freed Titan did not return to Olympus or seek to reclaim any position in the divine hierarchy. Instead, he disappeared into the mortal world, some said to walk among humans whose ancestors he had helped so dramatically. Others claimed to pursue his own purposes far from the politics and power structures that had destroyed him. Zeus allowed this departure without interference, perhaps because continuing to persecute Prometheus after he had already served his sentence would have made the king look petty, or perhaps because by then even Zeus understood that the warning he had dismissed had proven accurate in ways that made pursuing vendetta seem pointless. The world had changed exactly as Prometheus had predicted, and neither punishment nor denial had prevented that change from unfolding according to its own inevitable logic. The legacy of Prometheus's warning and the gods' decision to ignore it extended far beyond the immediate question of divine authority over mortals. It became a foundational story about the danger of refusing to adapt when circumstances change, about how power structures that respond to criticism with punishment rather than consideration ultimately destroy themselves regardless of how invincible they appear in the moment. The Olympians' choice to prioritize comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, to protect their pride rather than engaging honestly with challenges to their policies, created exactly the outcome they had hoped to avoid. By the time they recognized this pattern, it was too late to reverse course, and the best they could do was manage a decline that might have been prevented if they had listened when someone who understood long-term consequences had offered them a chance to change direction. Modern scholars looking back at the myth of Prometheus tend to focus on the dramatic elements, the theft of fire, and the eternal punishment and the eventual liberation. But the more crucial moment, the one that explains everything that followed, was that council meeting where Prometheus delivered his warning and the gods chose to ignore it. That decision, made from pride and fear and unwillingness to question established policies, shaped the future in ways that no amount of subsequent punishment or denial could alter. The Titan had offered them truth about trajectories they were setting in motion and alternatives they still had time to pursue. They had chosen blindness instead, and by the time sight returned, it revealed a world that no longer needed them in the ways they had once been essential. The warning Prometheus gave was ultimately proven correct, but proving it cost him centuries of agony and cost the gods everything they had believed was eternal and secure. Prometheus saw the future and tried to prevent catastrophe, but the gods chose pride over wisdom. His warning was ignored not because it was wrong, but because it required admitting that divine authority was more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. By the time the Olympians recognized their mistake, Prometheus was chained to a mountain, and the world was already changing in exactly the ways he had predicted. His warning remains relevant because the pattern it revealed is universal. Power that refuses adaptation, that responds to criticism with punishment, that prioritizes its own comfort over honest assessment of threats, will ultimately collapse under contradictions it would not acknowledge while change was still possible. If this hidden truth changed how you see divine authority in human progress, like this video, subscribe for stories that reveal the warnings history ignored. Share this with someone who needs to hear that speaking truth to power matters even when power refuses to listen, and comment with other myths you want us to investigate. See you in the next video.